was Easter, and they had quarantined themselves. They sat in an upstairs room, and they waited for time to pass. They wondered when it would be safe to go outside again. And how much longer are we going to be stuck in here? Will things ever go back to normal? A week ago, they never could have anticipated that this would be their new reality. Things, though, had changed so quickly. Most of them had lost their jobs, and when this was over, they were going to have to go back and start again. Some would have to try to relaunch a business. Others would try to get an old job back. But for now, they sit in this room trying to keep their distance from people and waiting for some updated news about what's happening on the outside. But it looked like they were going to be there for a while, and they could feel the anxiety building as they thought about how much life was going to change when this was all over. On that Easter evening, they sat quarantined in an upstairs room, and they were filled with fear and facing an uncertain future. And it may sound like I'm describing Easter for us today in the year 2020, but it turns out this Easter has a lot in common with the first Easter, because on that first Easter, everything was shut down. And after Jesus was crucified and put in a tomb, and his followers realized what that meant, they were filled with fear. I mean, would they be next? And anxiety grows when two factors come together, when there is this heightened sense of vulnerability and a diminished sense of power. When you feel vulnerable, but it seems that you can't do anything to change your circumstances, that is a recipe for anxiety. And it is the way I think many of us are feeling this Easter. But to be clear, it's the way the followers of Jesus were feeling on that first Easter. They, more than 2,000 years ago, were overwhelmed with fear and anxiety. John 20, verse 9 says that Sunday evening, the disciples were meeting behind locked doors because they were afraid. Now, we have some language that we might use to describe what the disciples are doing. It's language that we wouldn't have used. It really wasn't even a part of our vocabulary a few months ago, but we would say that the followers of Jesus were social distancing, or we might say they were sheltering at home. And much like us, they were trying to understand, how could this have happened? How could things have gone so wrong so quickly? Because just a week before, they had entered the city of Jerusalem with Jesus on a donkey, and the people were worshiping him. And within a week, their whole world had been turned upside down. And now, Jesus was dead and buried, and with him, their hopes and their dreams for the future. And so now they are quarantined, and they are trying to understand what their new normal is going to look like. It is amazing how quickly things can change. My daughter Morgan and her fiance Harrison had planned a big wedding for May 16th. More than 500 invitations were ready to be sent out. Dresses were on the way, tuxes had been ordered, venues had been reserved, deposits had been made. A special honeymoon had been planned, and there were going to be all kinds of showers and parties leading up to that big day, and it was going to be what she had dreamed of since she was a little girl. And then things started to change. And they would adjust, and then things changed some more, and they would adjust some more. And then things would change again, and they would change again. And then came the cancellations, showers canceled, venues canceled, plane tickets canceled. Nothing was going according to plan. When I saw Morgan a few days ago, I could tell she wasn't herself. I said, "Hey, beautiful, you hanging in there with all of this?" And she looked at me with those big brown eyes that have melted my heart since the day she was born. And her eyes welled up with tears, and she said, "My honeymoon got canceled today." Well, I've been a husband and a father long enough to learn the hard way that this isn't the time to offer perspective and problem solving. And so I gave my girl a hug, and I told her I was sorry. And she said, "It's just that nothing is going the way it's supposed to." If there was ever a sentence that describes what life can be like, it's that one. Nothing seems to be going the way it's supposed to. Now look, I know we shouldn't be surprised by any of that. In fact, a few chapters earlier in John 16, Jesus told his followers very directly, in this world you will face trials and you will face sorrows. In Matthew 24, Jesus tells his followers that before he returns, before he comes again, it will be nation rising up against nation, and there will be earthquakes and pestilence. The word we might use, pandemics. So we shouldn't be surprised. Well, here's what happens to the disciples on that first Easter. They are filled with fear. They've quarantined themselves behind locked doors. And while they're there, they've heard whispers of Jesus and his resurrection, but they didn't have proof, and they needed some evidence, something they could hold on to. And that evening, the hope they needed was about ready to make his way through their locked doors, because John 20, verse 19 tells us, suddenly Jesus was standing there among them. Peace be with you, he said. Suddenly Jesus is with them, and that house, in a moment, has gone from anxious to being filled with peace. And what Jesus did on that first Easter is what Jesus wants to do on this Easter. Because look, they weren't meeting in a church building. They weren't at the temple. There weren't thousands of them gathered together. Jesus showed up to a small group of people in a room of someone's house. And I just really believe that's what he wants to do in your house today. And I think what he said to them is what he would say now. He would say, peace be with you. Peace be with you. Peace be with you when you've cleaned the house and it looks like a war zone in less than 24 hours. Peace when your child climbs into your important Zoom calls. Peace when you're overwhelmed by the irony that you are quarantined, but you can't get a moment alone. Peace when you felt lonely and isolated long before the quarantine started, but now it just feels like you've got no one. And peace to the college student, because you were living on your own and you had to move home, and now your parents are calling the shots again. Peace to those of you who are on your 46th Hallmark movie. Peace when you think it's Friday and you realize it's only Monday. Peace when you ran out of toilet paper and all the kids are home from school. And peace, I would say, peace to you poor people who love routine and structure, because it's just all gone right now. Peace when the kids in the house have lost control and you're about ready to lose your mind. Peace when you can't hug your kids because you are a healthcare worker caring for people who might be infectious. Peace to you who have lost a loved one in the middle of this. And you're not only grieving your loved one, but you're grieving the absence of a real funeral. Peace to those of you who have moved your parents into a nursing home, but now you can't even see them. Peace to you, my daughter. When you spend your whole life planning and looking forward to a wedding and honeymoon, and it's not at all how you thought it would be. And so Jesus appears to them, and he speaks peace. And the next thing he does, I love this, is he offers proof, gives them evidence. Look at verse 20. It says, as he spoke, what did he do? He showed them the wounds in his hands and his side. He gives them evidence to believe that he rose from the dead. And I mean, if you believe that, if you really believe that Jesus conquered death and rose from the dead, it changes everything. Jesus shows them the evidence. There's a best-selling book called The Case for Easter. It's written by Lee Strobel, and Lee's background is in law and investigative journalism. And so he lays out the evidence for the resurrection in The Case for Easter. And this week I had a chance to interview Lee, and I asked him if he would just take a few minutes to share his story and to share some of the evidence of the resurrection with our church family. Take a look. Hey, Lee, thank you for joining us. So one of the things I love about The Case for Easter is that you didn't write that as a a seminary professor or as even a theological student or as a pastor, you were a cynic at the time you were researching that book. So tell us about that time in your life and how you decided to write a book and study the resurrection.
Well, I was an atheist for much of my life. My background's in journalism and law. So you can imagine I tend to be a person who looks at evidence, facts, reason, logic. And I lived a life, consequently, that was consistent with that philosophy. In other words, I thought if there is no God, if there is no heaven, if there is no hell, if there is no judgment, then the most logical way to live my life would be as a hedonist, someone who just pursued pleasure. And that's what I did. So I lived a very immoral and drunken and profane and narcissistic life. I mean, that was my life. What people saw, I was legal editor of the Chicago Tribune. And what they saw was me winning awards for investigative reporting. But what they didn't see was the other side, which was me literally drunk in the snow in an alley on Saturday night. And this affected everybody. It affected my family. I remember my little daughter, Allison, when she was a toddler, if she was playing with some toys, some blocks or something in the living room, and she would hear me come home from work through the front door, her natural reaction was just to gather her toys and go in her room and shut the door. Is he going to be drunk again? Or, she at least it was nice and quiet in there. So that was our life. And I was successful in my career, but at the same time, I was crumbling inside.
Did you have interest in faith at this time? I think you may have been the one to introduce this idea of the difference between a skeptic and a cynic, right? Like someone who is asking questions versus someone who's not even open and not seeking answers. Where were you spiritually?
Yeah, I was in many ways a cynic, and it was really what changed things for me was my wife came to me one day and gave me the worst news I could ever get as an atheist, which is that she had become a Christian. She had met a woman named Linda, who was a Christian and a nurse. They became best friends. Linda shared Jesus with her, brought her to church. Leslie asked a lot of questions and ended up coming to faith. And I thought, oh, no. I mean, literally, the first word that went through my mind was divorce. I was going to walk out. In fact, she had just planted a flower garden in our backyard, and I had to go mow the lawn right after she told me. So I mowed down all her flowers that she had planted. I was just so mad. But I stuck around, and I saw two things happen. I saw a lot of positive changes in her character and in her values and the way she related to me and the children. And it was winsome and it was attractive. But at the same time, I wanted our old life back. I wanted my old Leslie back. And so I thought, well, wait a minute. What if I disproved Christianity? And I knew the entire Christian faith hinged on the resurrection of Jesus. So I thought, I've seen, as a journalist, plenty of dead bodies. I've never seen any of them come back to life, especially after 3 days. So I thought, how hard could this be to disprove a resurrection? I thought I could do it in a long weekend. And so I decided to take my journalism training, my legal training, and systematically investigate what is the historical data, what is the evidence. And I tried to do it like an umpire would ump a baseball game. I'd call a ball and a strike. I wanted to be honest. I was a journalist. I wanted to look at both sides. But my secret hope was I could disprove it and rescue her from this cult that she'd gotten involved in.
How long was that journey of you studying the resurrection and trying to disprove the faith by proving that Jesus didn't come back to life?
It was 1 year and 9 months from start to finish. And it was a cumulative case. So over time, I got a little bit of evidence at a time, a few facts, few more facts. And of course, as a journalist, I was trained to investigate things. That's what I did. And so it was common for me to do research. And so it kind of fit my personality to do that kind of research.
So you've written hundreds of pages that speak to the evidence for the resurrection. I'd love to hear just what was personally compelling to you. Were there a few pieces of evidence that were watershed moments for you on this journey?
Yeah, I like to summarize the evidence using 4 words that begin with the letter E, because Easter begins with E. And I'll go through it real quickly. The first E is for execution, that Jesus was really dead after being crucified. No less of a source than Journal of the American Medical Association, which is a secular, scientific, peer-reviewed medical journal, carried an investigation into the death of Jesus. And this was their conclusion, quote, "Clearly, the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead even before the wound to his side was inflicted." We have so much evidence for this that even the atheist New Testament scholar, Gerd Ludemann, says that it's historically indisputable that Jesus was dead. So the first E is execution, Jesus was dead. Second E stands for the word early. We have early accounts or early reports of the resurrection of Jesus. In other words, reports that go right back virtually to the scene itself. Why is that important? Because I used to think, like a lot of skeptics, that the resurrection was a legend. And I knew it took time for legend to develop in the ancient world. So I figured 100, 150 years after the life of Jesus, legends developed, and that's where the idea of the resurrection came from. But what I learned blew that out of the water, because we have preserved for us a creed, a statement of conviction of the earliest church that has been dated back by scholars to within months of the death of Jesus. And this is eyewitness based. It mentions the names of specific eyewitnesses and groups of eyewitnesses, including 500 people at once who encountered the resurrected Jesus. And this report of the resurrection, as I say, has been dated back by many scholars, including James D.G. Dunn, who's one of the greatest scholars in this area. And his conclusion was, quote, "This tradition or this creed, we can be entirely confident was formulated as tradition within months of the death of Jesus." That's far too quickly to write it off as a legend. Third E is for the empty tomb. And the strongest evidence for that is everybody admitted the tomb was empty. Even the opponents of Jesus, when the disciples began proclaiming that Jesus had risen, we know from sources inside and outside the New Testament that how the opponents of Jesus responded was by saying, the disciples stole the body. They're conceding the tomb is empty. They're trying to explain how it got empty. And of course, the disciples didn't have the motive or the means or the opportunity. So everybody, there's no dispute. Even the opponents of Jesus conceded implicitly that the tomb was empty. And then the fourth E is eyewitnesses. Most of what we know in terms of facts from ancient history, we know based on one or maybe two sources of information. And yet, for the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus, we have no fewer than 9 ancient sources, inside and outside the New Testament, confirming and corroborating their conviction that they encountered the risen Christ. That is an avalanche of historical data. And so that, in a nutshell, is the kind of evidence that I, as a journalist trained in law, found clear and compelling that Jesus, he didn't just claim to be the Son of God, he backed up that claim by returning from the dead.
One of the points that you make that was really compelling for me was when you make the point they'll die for something they believe is true, but they won't die for something they know is a lie. Am I getting that right?
That's exactly right. And that was probably the final piece of the puzzle that went into place for me. You know, we have 7 ancient sources, 6 of them outside the Bible, that confirm that the disciples lived lives of deprivation and suffering as a result of their proclamation that Jesus had risen. What actually happened to them in terms of their deaths can get a little bit murky in history, but that's not the point. Their willingness to die for it is indisputable. Well, of all human beings who've ever lived in history, the disciples were in a unique position to know whether this is true or whether it's false. They were there. They talked with the risen Christ. They ate with them. They touched him. They knew the truth. And knowing the truth, they were willing to die for it. That tells me something about the veracity of their claims.
Did you have a set time that you remember where you stepped over a line?
Absolutely. It was 2:00 in the afternoon on November the 8th of 1981. And I had set out all of my evidence to kind of review it once more, because I said to myself, a good juror reaches a verdict. And so I reviewed everything and came to that. And that's when the scales just kind of went like that. And I realized this is true. And then I didn't know what to do. But my wife had pointed out a verse to me, John 1:12. Says, "But as many as received him, To them, he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name. And I realize that verse forms an equation of what it means to become a child of God. Believe plus receive equals become. So I said, okay, now I get it. I believe, based on the data of history, that Jesus didn't just claim to be the Son of God, he backed up that claim by returning from the dead. I believe it, but that's not enough. I had to receive. Receive what? Receive this free gift of forgiveness and eternal life that Jesus purchased for me on the cross when he died as my substitute to pay for all of my sin. And when I would receive that gift of his grace in a prayer of repentance and faith, I would become a child of God. So I got on my knees and I poured out a confession of a lifetime of immorality that would absolutely curl your hair. And at that moment, I received complete and total forgiveness through Jesus Christ, and I became a child of God.
And then some of the most compelling evidence, I think, for the resurrection is what Jesus does in our lives after we believe and receive. I think one of the most powerful ways God has used your story is not just evidence that you have shared with people, but it's your own personal life. So I'd love to have us end by you just personally saying how God has redeemed, how the resurrection has personally changed your life and your family.
Sure. I mean, after I prayed that prayer, and after I was baptized, and after I became part of a vibrant church like yours, after I learned to read the Bible with fresh eyes, after I learned to pray and to worship, God began to change my values, my character, my morality, my priorities, my attitudes, my worldview, my relationships, my parenting, my marriage. I mean, all these things over time began to change for the good. So much so that my little daughter, Allison, was 5 years old when I came to faith. And all she had known was a dad who had been absent, angry. I actually kicked a hole through our living room wall in anger one day, coming home drunk. That was her whole existence for the first 5 years of her life. But starting on that Sunday afternoon, after I came to faith in Christ, and over time, as he began to work in my life, she started to watch. Something's changing with my dad. Something's different with my dad. Something's new with my dad. And it took about 4 or 5 months. And then finally one day, it was a Sunday, she came up first to her Sunday school teacher and then up to Leslie. And she said, I want God to do for me what he's done for Daddy.
Some of the most compelling evidence for the resurrection is to see lives change one at a time. Lee talked about one of the biggest changes in his life was experiencing that kind of peace, but that wasn't all. His life didn't just go from being hostile and volatile to being filled with peace. Before he believed and received, he was angry and he was moody, but now his life is marked with joy. His sins have been forgiven, and God's grace got rid of his guilt and his shame. And before he believed and received, he was working hard, he even had some success, but he was frustrated and life felt aimless, but now his life is marked by purpose. And listen, this is the difference that the resurrection makes in our lives. And it's as true today as it was on that first Easter Sunday. And Jesus came in and he spoke peace in that home. And he showed them evidence. And verse 20 says they were filled with joy when they saw the Lord. Verse 21 says, again, he said, peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you. And so Jesus appears to them. And here's what they find in the resurrected Jesus. They find peace and joy and purpose for life. And what's interesting is if you keep reading, you find out that the outside circumstances don't really change for these followers of Jesus. Like the threats, they don't go away. What was causing them such fear and anxiety, those things don't disappear. In fact, it seems like they escalate. In other words, the storm wasn't immediately replaced by clear skies and sunshine, but what they discovered in Jesus was a joy and a peace and a purpose that was found and rooted in a hope that could not be shaken. One of the most beautiful things for me to witness as a pastor these past few weeks is that what we talk about is true. That when we talk about the peace and the joy that Jesus offers us, it's real, like it's all real. And I've seen so much evidence of that in the middle of a pandemic where the world feels overwhelmed with fear and they're upset and they're disillusioned because of what they've lost, I have seen follower after follower of Jesus living with peace and joy and purpose. People like Paige, a Southeast member, who met a blind 90-year-old veteran who had no way of getting groceries. And so Paige shops for him and makes sure that he's taken care of. I think about our children's ministry who emptied out the nursery room and donated 10,000 shoe covers to the Veterans Hospital ER workers. I think of Tina, who learned about a single mom who needed to work from home, but she didn't have a desk and certain supplies. And so Tina and some of her friends got a desk and went and got a Walmart gift card. I think about Brad, whose men's group bought 40 dozen donuts for healthcare workers to let them know that they're thinking of them and praying for them. I think about Sarah, who is a single mom, and she delivered a box of food with her boys to an 82-year-old neighbor. I think about Glenn, who turned his neighborhood subdivision into a ministry ground. He got all of his neighbors together to sing happy birthday to a 90-year-old neighbor. And she couldn't leave the house, but just because she was isolated didn't mean that she had to feel alone. And I think of this church. I think of this church family who gave the largest normal weekend offering in the history of the church this past weekend. And there were no six-figure gifts. It was just one person after another who understands that in the middle of the darkness, it's the time for the church to shine a bright light, that now is the time for followers of Jesus to rise up and give of themselves so that we can be the hands and the feet of Jesus. And so we can live with this peace and this joy and this purpose because of the resurrection. Because the resurrection means that this life is not all there is, that we have hope beyond this life. Our hope is in heaven. Now look, just stop and think about that in context. Like, what's the worst thing that the coronavirus or any other disease can do to you? What's the worst thing? Worst case scenario is death. But if you're a follower of Jesus, worst case scenario immediately becomes best case scenario. This is the difference that Jesus makes. And so Jesus said in John 11, I am the resurrection and the life, and anyone who believes in me will live even after he dies. And so Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, then where, O death, is your victory, and where, O grave, is your sting? I love the way the Message puts this. Death is swallowed up by triumphant life. Who's got the last word, O death? O death, who's afraid of you now? And Paul is talking trash to death. He's mocking death because he knows that the resurrection means that death has been defeated once and for all. I was reading on the CDC website this week where the term corona comes from. And according to the CDC website, the virus was given the name corona because of, quote, the crown-like spikes on its surface. That apparently under extreme magnification, the coronavirus looks like a thorny crown. But quite literally, it is the thorny crown virus, and it has come to represent the pain and the suffering and the disappointment of this world that seems to have no end. And I don't want you to miss it, because Jesus understands that. Like right here, right now, Jesus understands, because before there was a thorny crown virus, we know that Jesus wore a crown of thorns. He wore a crown of thorns so that the thorny crown virus would not have the final word in this life. And on the cross, he wore a crown of thorns. He experienced the suffering and the pain of this world, and he breathed his final breath. His dead body was laid in a tomb for 3 days. But in that tomb, Jesus was putting an end to suffering and death once and for all. In that tomb, Jesus was having the final word. And on the third day, he rose from the dead. And that means that we have a hope that cannot be shaken. We have peace and joy and purpose because our hope is in heaven. And Revelation says in heaven, there'll be no more mourning or crying, no more suffering or pain, no more death or disease. Some of you know I keep a running list of what won't be in heaven. I call it my no more list. I like to update it and then share it, the new version, once in a while, just reminding all of us what won't be in heaven. Because Jesus died and rose again, it means that one day in heaven, there'll be no more Parkinson's, no more death row, no more cancer, no more divorce, no more rejection, no more loneliness, no more jail cells, no more depression, no more casts or crutches, no more wheelchairs, no more pacemakers, no more radiation or chemotherapy, no more suicide bombers or school shootings. There'll be no more anxiety medication, no more middle of the night phone calls. There'll be no more crosses on the side of the road. There'll be no more child abuse. There'll be no more rape. There'll be no more breakups. There'll be no more coughs or colds or flu shots. There'll be no more acne, no more love handles or saddlebags, no more cottage cheese thighs, no more double chins, no more body deodorant, no more deodorant stains. No more shaving or waxing, no more yelling or fighting, no more traffic, no more road rage, no more addiction, no more drama, no more hormones, no more crash diets, no more spanks, no more gossip, no more stubbed toes or embarrassing moments, no more concussions, no more autism, no more doctors, no more needles, no more taxes or bills, no more mechanics or dentists or lawyers or plastic surgeons, no more politicians, no more elections, no more funeral homes, no more orphanages, no more nursing homes, no more waiting rooms, no more animal hospitals, no more treatment centers, no more courtrooms, no more divorce papers or pink slips, no more foreclosure notices or motionless ultrasounds, no more tiny caskets, no more shame, no more thorns and thistles. No more conflict and confusion, no more dust and ashes, no more quarantines, no more gloves or face masks, no more social distancing or sheltering in place, no more toilet paper or Zoom calls, no more hand sanitizer, no more Lysol spray, no more ventilators or vaccines, no more viruses. No more. Jesus says in Revelation, I have come and I make everything new. I'd love to ask you on this Easter to remember the hope of the resurrection by taking some time and focusing on what won't be in heaven. Maybe in your own home, you make your own list, your own no more list of what won't be there. I'd love for you to share it with me. You can post it on social media with the hashtag no more list. But this is how we maintain our hope. We remember where it's found. It's found in Jesus, and it's not found in this world. It's found in the life to come. So look, it's amazing how things can change and how quickly it can happen. And I know that some of you never thought you'd be locked up, never thought you'd be dealing with this kind of fear and anxiety and addiction, depression. You just never saw this coming. Some of you can't even believe you're watching this right now, but I believe that Jesus wants to do this Easter what he did on that first Easter. I believe he wants to show up in your home. I believe he wants to make his way through maybe the locked doors of your house. And he wants to come in and he wants to reverse the curse of sin in your life. He wants to turn graves into gardens. He wants to replace your fear with faith, your anxiety with peace, your anger with joy, and he wants to give your life purpose. The question is, do you believe? And are you ready to receive? Let me pray. God, this Easter feels like it's different than any other Easter, and yet we realize that maybe it was a lot like the first one, where Jesus, you came back to life, and when you came back from the grave, you carried the keys of death with you, and you now offer us joy and hope and peace that can only be found in you. And so, God, I pray for everyone who is watching this right now. It's my belief that it's no accident that they're watching this. I pray that you would show up in their home and that you would speak peace and joy and purpose into their lives, that they would find in you what they have been looking for. Jesus, I thank you for your grace that meets us right where we are. You don't have to wait for us to walk into a church building or attend a service. You're coming to us right here and right now, and you're giving us your love and your grace. I pray that you would allow us to believe it, to really believe it, and then to receive it. It's in Jesus' name we pray.